Thank you. You're now joining the conference. Your line has been muted.
So thanks for choosing to take part in the webinar. I'm Helen Moffat, and I've been working as a clinical psychologist in obesity services for the past 7 years, and for the past 4 years or so developing third wave approaches. So both my own experience of this and the feedback we've had from clients has been extremely positive, which is why I wanted to take this opportunity of using this webinar to share this with you, both how we've worked and what we've learned. So just to give you an overview of what we aim to cover today, our aim is to encourage psychologists and our colleagues in healthcare to find ways to initiate more helpful conversations about weight concerns, whatever setting you work in, whether that's a weight management setting or another healthcare setting, and particularly mental health settings where clearly these are very relevant concerns for many patients, but not always ones that people feel comfortable to address. So secondly, I hope to illustrate how third wave cognitive behaviour therapy can enhance weight management interventions, and to share some specific tools which we've developed in clinical practice, building very much on the work of others, and to be enable colleagues to incorporate these ideas into their practice. I don't aim for this to be an ACT or CFT training, and I would stress that if you're keen to incorporate these ideas into clinical practice, it would be great to follow up with further reading, training, and seek support and supervision in doing so. We will be covering in an hour a very rapid overview, so there'll be times when I move through slides quite quickly, but as Laura's mentioned, you'll be sent copies of the slides afterwards, so you can spend a little more time on some of those which are self-explanatory. And at the end of the webinar, we also have, I also have some references that you won't be able to take down today, I don't suppose, but you will be sent those, so you'll be able to access those in more detail. So just to give you a quick overview of what we'll cover, we'll touch on the learning outcomes that I intend to cover, have a moment to reflect on obesity, the context, or the wider context of obesity, and also how we understand obesity, give a quick overview of third wave CBT, and then start with acceptance and commitment therapy and an ACT-based formulation using the matrix. I'll then talk about the ACT Hexaflex and how this applies to this client group. And then we'll move on to compassion-focused therapy and the need for self-compassion and how we can develop this. And just briefly at the end, I'll talk about the evidence, both the published evidence and the evidence that we've gathered within our own service. And as Laura's mentioned, I'll respond to questions at the end rather than stopping and starting as we go through. So I won't go through these learning outcomes in one by one, as you'll already have seen these in the information about the webinar, but they're there for you to refer to and perhaps come back to at the end to assess to what extent we've achieved these. So starting with where I'm coming from, literally that's Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland. I've been working in a specialist Tier 3 weight management service. So that's a specialist service, and the individuals we've been working with tend to have fairly complex, severe obesity, typically an average body mass index of 48 kilograms per meter squared. We're a team of psychologists and dietitians working closely together, and I would like to acknowledge the contribution that my psychology and dietetic colleagues have had as we've worked in a very collaborative way developing the programme over the last 3 years. I'd just like to pause for a moment to think about obesity. Obesity tends to be framed as a problem of people needing to eat less and move more, and I really just want to stress that it's important that we understand it's a much more complex, multifaceted issue than this, and there are many internal and external factors contributing to obesity. The Foresight report was published back in 2007, and this identified over 100 different individual and environmental factors that contribute and maintain obesity. And I think Engel's Bio-psychosocial framework remains the most helpful way to think about the factors which contribute to obesity and maintain obesity. So this would cover the social and environmental factors, including the many sort of technological factors which in transportation, in mechanization, which mean we tend to have very sedentary lifestyles compared to our ancestors, and the many, both in work settings and screen-based entertainment, mean this is just we're more prone to be sitting and spending sedentary time than moving about and burning energy. We also have very easy access to cheap and highly palatable energy-dense foods. So both of these factors making it very easy to overeat and be inactive. What's also emerging more and more so since 2007, is research on the genetic factors, the biological factors that contribute to obesity, particularly making some individuals more vulnerable to overeating and gaining weight. And of course there are many psychological factors which play a significant part, which we'll touch on today, including behaviour, knowledge and our responses to past and current stresses. I just want to also stress a particular aspect of the lived experience of many people, particularly with severe obesity, and that's the impact of shame and stigma on those living with obesity. So weight stigma is based on the overly simplistic idea that obesity is locating the blame for obesity in the individual. And weight stigma and discrimination is pervasive and occurs in many different settings, as Rebecca Paul's research shows, and there's references highlighting this at the end of the webinar. So in employment settings, education, media, and importantly in healthcare settings as well. And we know that experiencing weight stigma within healthcare settings has resulted in some very unhelpful experiences for individuals, including weight gain, greater vulnerability to psychological distress, lower self-esteem, greater body dissatisfaction, and a sense of shame for individuals living with obesity. And certainly many of the people that we've worked with have talked about these experiences and the vicious cycle they encounter of the stress of weight-based stigma contributing to increased eating and further weight gain. I just want to share with you the words of one of our clients who worked with us over 2 years and went on quite a dramatic journey of change. I'll call him Danny. He's a young man in his 30s, and he was generous enough to share with us his story and to give us permission to share this widely to help others understand his lived experience of severe obesity. And in his words, which I'll share here, I think this very powerfully demonstrates how this can feel to an individual. He talks about feeling isolated because of his size. He said, I hated going out, people staring, pointing, saying stuff. It was embarrassing. You just didn't feel like a human. You felt like a mistake. You just didn't want to be seen. I just felt horrible. I mean, I wasn't living, I was surviving just. And I was so miserable, angry with myself, not just with myself, everything. I hated it. So while this is just one person's lived experience, it certainly very powerfully describes just the impact that that can have, and something really important, I think, to bear in mind as we're working with individuals with these challenges. So on to an overview of third wave cognitive behavior therapy. What do we mean? Over the last 10 to 20 years, CBT has expanded its focus to include a number of so-called third wave approaches, which seek to blend traditional CBT principles with new concepts to behaviour psychotherapies such as mindfulness, acceptance and compassion. And it's these three therapies in particular that we're drawing on here. So that's acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness. So while traditional CBT is aimed at symptom reduction, third wave approaches tend to take a broader approach with greater emphasis on empowerment, increasing awareness of inner processes, and the quality and quantity of activities that give life meaning. And this is particularly important in the context of weight management services, where a narrow focus on weight alone can be both unhelpful and counterproductive. So let's start with acceptance and commitment therapy, generally shortened to ACT. At the heart of ACT is the aim of helping our clients achieve psychological flexibility. This isn't about feeling good all the time, but moving towards what we call valued living, doing what matters. So living a life that's meaningful and fulfilling isn't always going to take us down a comfortable or straightforward path, because a life that's meaningful often involves making space for uncomfortable feelings. And what we aim for is to ensure that people don't get stuck on the challenging parts of this. So this diagram is from Russ Harris's book, ACT Made Simple, and reduces ACT to its essence in a very accessible way, which I've certainly found helpful to share with clients. 3 cornerstones of making room for difficult thoughts and feelings, being fully present in the here and now, and doing what matters. So in our service, we primarily work in a group-based approach, and we often start with 2 questions, which really are oriented to help people think about what's important and why they're there. And the first of these is, how many times have you started a diet in your life? So we'll have some participants who might say 2 or 3 times, but for many of our participants, the answer is often so many times I can't actually remember. And then we go on to a second question of how many times have you lost some weight but then regained this? And the answers tend to be very similar. So I think this highlights, and this discussion highlights, the importance of recognizing that people have often been on a very long and complex, challenging journey in terms of trying to make changes and address weight. It's not for want of trying that they've struggled with this in many cases. And so their ambivalence about trying something new, trying something different is understandable. I think it's really important, and certainly this is where ACT would point us to, is exploring values to tap into their intrinsic motivation to move towards what matters to them in terms of small committed actions. In other words, we need to consider the why and not just focus on the what. Why is it important that they might want to make changes in their lives, and not just what are the changes and how they go about them. And I think this approach also reflects that our program is very much focused not just on diet alone, but on changing a relationship with food, changing a relationship with yourself, not simply to achieve weight loss, but in much broader terms to move towards a more fulfilling life, which may mean a slight change in weight, but may mean also a lot of other changes as well. So one of the slides we use in our groups is this one, which asks some very important but challenging questions that can be very emotive for our clients. And we stress that this is very much the start of a process of looking at things, and we're not expecting quick and tidy answers in session 1 or session 2. But these are themes that run throughout the program and we keep coming back to. As I say, they're often very challenging and emotive for people to answer early on, and perhaps things that they've thought very little about or find very difficult initially to tune into. And in line with ACT, we distinguish between values and goals. So values are how you want to behave deep in your heart, and these are a direction that you want to keep moving in, an ongoing process that doesn't come to an end, whereas a goal is something much more finite, something you want to get, to complete, to own, to have or achieve. And once you're there, once it's achieved and it's over, it's done with, it's completed, you can tick it off on the list. And values can be seen as like the beacon of light from the top of a lighthouse, which is why we have this image there. And I particularly like this metaphor because for most people, the journey towards values and a meaningful life isn't a simple linear one, but one that involves changes of direction, detours, and very often stormy seas along the way. So we'll return to values and committed actions later, just as we do throughout our intervention. It's a recurring theme on an ongoing basis. The second core theme we touched on early on is how much we're actually aware of what is happening in the present moment and how much we're simply operating on autopilot. In other words, mindful awareness, which we might define as learning to pay attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment to things as they actually are. And most of us will recognize the tendency that we all have to go about our day-to-day tasks on autopilot. So we've left the house and we've arrived at work, but we can't actually remember, did we switch the iron off or the hair straighteners off? Did we lock the front door? And how much of that drive to work did we actually pay attention to what we were doing, or was our mind completely taken up with the other kinds of thoughts that filled our head? And as we look at this, people often recognize that they're engaging in many behaviors which play a part in their weight concerns with little awareness of what they're actually doing. And again, this is something most of us can relate to. Our hand finds its way into the fridge or the biscuit tin, but our mind is somewhere else altogether. We can represent this concept of mindful awareness on a vertical axis of experience like this, which reflects the continuum of where our attention is actually focused at any particular time, from inside, head and heart or mental experiencing, to the other extreme of outside, hands and feet experiencing, or five senses experiencing. So what we can see, what we can smell, touch, hear and taste. And this is the first axis of what we call the ACT matrix. So the ACT matrix is a tool that we can use to build a collaborative understanding of the context and function of the behaviours that, in this instance, contribute to weight concerns. And Kevin Polk first developed the ACT matrix, and he describes it as a diagram about noticing. Working through the ACT matrix with a client, which I'll often do in the very first session, is an invitation for them to sort out their experiences, behaviours and stories. And it's a very collaborative, non-judgmental process, and often a very different kind of conversation than one that they've ever had before in relation to concerns about weight. It's more about the process and there being a right or wrong way of doing it. So the first attempt isn't fixed in tablets of stone, but it does form the basis for a very collaborative start to formulation. So as I've said, the vertical line is the experiencing line, noticing where our attention is focused from mental experiencing to five senses experiencing. We also have a horizontal line that cuts across this that we can think of as the behaviour line, challenging us to consider if the behaviour is driven by things you want to get away from or things you value and want more of in your life. So this slide illustrates these key drivers for behavioural choices common to all animals and humans. So in terms of animal behaviour, moving away from something is scientifically termed aversive control, as this is usually going to be some kind of threat, as it is here. And when animals move towards things, whether it's a reproductive partner or a source of comfort or sustenance, this is termed appetitive control. Unlike rabbits, of course, humans are verbal creatures with sophisticated problem-solving ability, and this definitely can complicate things. In particular, we often want to move away from unwanted feelings, words, or stories that we experience as threatening. And we may find ourselves living a life that largely consists of away moves, trying to retreat from unwanted experiences and less connected with the things that matter and make life meaningful. So we can pull this together in what we call the psychological flexibility matrix. The matrix brings together the vertical experiencing line with a horizontal behaviour line and provides a very practical framework that we can use to sort out experiences, thoughts and behaviour. And Kevin Polk would put the client, or me, in the middle, noticing what's going on. And I find that one of the best ways to familiarise yourself with this is to try it for yourself with your own experiences, which you can perhaps do at a later time. Speaking personally, I've been more drawn to use this as a tool for noticing what's going on in my own experience than perhaps more traditional CBT tools such as thought records. So to give you a sense of this, what I'm going to do now is walk through it using the responses and observations of another young man we've worked with who I'll call Callum. So our starting point is the top right-hand quadrant, and the question we would be asking is, what's important to you and who's important to you? Sometimes, as I've said, that question of what's important can be quite a challenging one for people to answer, whereas who's important might be an easier starting point that leads on to what's important. And Callum identified friends, being social is really important, being able to feel fitter and have more energy, being able to manage his work better, and ultimately having the confidence to maybe begin to think about having an intimate relationship. And I would say, well, that's a great starting point. We might well add to this as the sessions go by, but it gives us a really useful beginning to work with. We then go to the top left-hand quadrant, and the question I'd be asking here is, well, what shows up that might get in the way of you moving towards what's important? Are there difficult thoughts, feelings, fears? So Callum identified family stresses, arguments as often the hooks that take him into that place of feeling stressed and perhaps also feeling isolated, worries about his work, particularly when his boss would make what felt like unreasonable demands on him, and often feeling tired, feeling down, just feeling a general sense of failure. And these would be the things that might get in the way of him moving towards what's important. So then I would ask the question, focusing on the bottom left quadrant, so what do you do when these difficult, uncomfortable thoughts and feelings show up, when these things you don't want to think or feel? And Callum could identify that these would be the times when he would engage in unplanned eating, irregular eating on the hoof, sometimes overeating when he felt stress, and certainly a high degree of avoiding situations, avoiding people, perhaps avoiding social situations, or avoiding physical activity, for example. And it's not difficult to see the vicious cycle here between the thoughts and feelings at the top resulting in these behaviours, but also reinforcing those difficult thoughts and feelings. So Kevin Polk calls this a stuck loop, and most people can very readily relate to this pattern. So finally, we go to the bottom right quadrant and explore what towards moves are going on. What things might you be doing that take you towards what's important and who's important? And although Callum was struggling with this, he was able to identify that there were times when he could plan meals and snacks, times when he could take food into work, and these were towards moves. He also started playing football twice a week and walking to work. So what's important here is that there are some towards moves. It doesn't matter that they might not be very many, but it's a starting point. As I'll often say in our discussion about this, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and that single step, if it's in the towards direction, is really very important to recognize. So from the matrix, let's move on to the ACT Hexaflex diagram, and you can see that one maps onto the other. The Hexaflex offers a diagrammatic representation of the 6 core processes highlighted in ACT, which, depending on how they function, can contribute to a greater psychological flexibility or perhaps a greater sense of being stuck. And we'll go through each of these in more detail, highlighting aspects we've found to be particularly relevant and useful in the context of helping to address obesity. But you can see that there on the right-hand side, as mapping onto the matrix, we've got values, who's and what's important to you, and committed actions or goals, the small towards moves, the behavioural steps. Whilst on the left-hand side, connecting with the difficult thoughts and feelings that show up, we've got the importance of overcoming avoidance and willingness to tolerate, whether it's food cravings, pain, shame, self-consciousness, and diffusion from unhelpful thoughts and feelings, so stepping back from those thoughts and feelings that you tend to get caught up in or stuck with. We'll come back to self as context, or the ability to be more flexible in perspective taking, a bit later on, and that's where we see a real connection with compassion focused therapy. Let's start with present moment awareness at the top there. So there are a range of ways that we would try to endeavour to increase present moment awareness. That would include mindfulness practices that many of you will be familiar with, including mindful eating, and probably often shorter mindfulness practices such as a 3-minute breathing space that we would try to include in every session so that people are beginning to get some practice and lived experience of these things. We would also focus on self-monitoring, whether that's eating food diaries that include thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. Noticing the hooks in terms of those emotional hooks that pull you into the top left quadrant of the matrix, the kind of situations that Callum highlighted, such as the feeling that his boss was making difficult demands, or perhaps a family argument would be a hook for him. And we also try to help people distinguish real physical hunger from food cravings or other kinds of hunger, whether that's hunger for action, boredom, or an emotional kind of craving. And the hunger scale can be particularly useful in doing this and helping people really start to notice what they're actually feeling and reflect on this before making choices related to eating. The choice point model has been particularly developed and written about by Russ Harris, and we find this really helpful in introducing this idea early on, and it becomes a recurring theme throughout the program. And it highlights quite often that people hadn't really considered their behavior in terms of there actually being a choice that they're making. So as well as increasing present moment awareness, it also helps to increase the sense of their own volition being important here. And it really highlights how at a time of a challenging situation, perhaps when feeling stressed or lonely or sad, people face a choice, and it's very easy to be hooked into away moves by those difficult feelings, but recognizing that with awareness there is a choice in terms of taking action that takes you towards what's important. So avoidance is something that we all do and can recognize. I particularly notice that there seems to be a strong pattern in those living with severe obesity very often. And whether it's a brave face or a cheery face, this can often be very challenging for people to be more open to experiencing underlying pain, difficult thoughts and emotions. Another act metaphor is that engaging with avoidance is akin to feeding a hungry monster. The more you do it, the bigger the monster gets, until you eventually find yourself in a tug-of-war struggle, trying to pull away from these difficult, uncomfortable fears, anxieties, doubts. So the alternative to the struggle is letting go of the rope. In other words, willingness to experience some of these uncomfortable feelings rather than constantly trying to pull away, which takes up a lot of time and energy and leaves you unable to get on with living a meaningful life. Another metaphor, the ice cube metaphor, the ice cube experiment, is one that we found really brings to life this concept of willingness and making space for what's uncomfortable. And it's always much more effective when we do this in real life by bringing in some ice cubes and a whole pile of paper towels and asking our participants to hold one of those ice cubes in the palm of their hand. Naturally, the initial reaction is one of discomfort and an urge to get rid of the ice cube. And we ask them to sit with the ice cube in their hand for a few moments and notice the sensations and feelings, and actually how these are something they can make space for despite that initial urge to get rid of them. And we find that this experiment tends to stay in people's minds and be a really valuable shorthand for willingness. We say, remember the ice cube, the initial urge to drop it and get rid of it because it felt so uncomfortable, but the ability that people found within themselves to hold on to that uncomfortable feeling, and often noticing that it did in fact become much more tolerable or even fade as time went by. As I said, we return to the theme of values and committed actions again and again. As people start to get a clearer idea of what is important to them, we regularly review and reflect on this. And we use the concept of SMART goals, which many of you will be already familiar with from other contexts, and encourage our participants to identify their own goals, but reflect on whether these are achievable, whether they're specific, and share thinking around and experiences around what goes well and what doesn't go well, because this can be just as important and valuable to share the learning and notice what happens in people's efforts to try to achieve their goals. It can be quite challenging to get past the question when we ask people what's important. They often will say, well, I want to lose weight, which isn't a value in itself. So we might then follow up with the question, well, if you weren't struggling with weight concerns right now, what would you do more of? And that general discussion often leads to a more helpful tuning into underlying factors which are important in leading a fuller and more meaningful life. And we hope that goals will gradually become values-based habits as they become a more regular part of what people are able to do day to day. Again, this is a fairly lengthy quote from Danny, but I think it illustrates in his own words just what we're referring to here. He talks about the importance of identifying his own goals or committed actions. And as he says here, I wasn't just seeing it as a chore in the last paragraph. I wasn't just seeing it as a chore because I was beating my own goals, which I had, until I started the course, I didn't know anything about. They were realistic goals and what would suit you rather than what would suit the course and what's manageable in your own mind. So constantly reviewing and reflecting on the goals he identified for himself as we went along was what he felt made the difference to him in terms of achieving these. So in ACT, we can define the process of fusion as getting caught up in thoughts and feelings. And this is a product of what Paul Gilbert calls the tricky human brain. So while our feline friend here appears to be able to simply enjoy the feeling of a full tummy that comes with overeating and curl up and go to sleep, our human friend, with her capacity to reflect and problem solve, finds herself ruminating at length on self-critical thoughts of shame and failure. So human thinking and problem solving can be a mixed blessing. So there's a number of ways we try to encourage the process of diffusion in ACT terms, which is really noticing and moving away from the thoughts and feelings that we tend to get caught up in. And certainly monitoring and writing thoughts down is always a very useful starting point. Similarly, rephrasing from the thought, I'm a failure, to I'm having the thought that I'm a failure is a very simple change, but one that can be quite powerful in shifting from the I'm a failure feeling like a fact to noticing that this is actually only a thought or one particular way of looking at things. Another ACT metaphor that can be really useful is the clipboard metaphor, and again we would try to get people to actually try this out physically in the session. So we suggest that those unhelpful thoughts can be a bit like they're written on a clipboard. If you imagine holding that right up to your nose, you might even want to try this now. They're in your face, as it were. It's very difficult to see past those thoughts. It's very difficult to think about anything else when they're held up right up close to your face. So the urge we all have, understandably, is to push them away to arm's length. And again, when we ask our participants to do this, it readily becomes quite hard work. Quickly, arms start to get tired, and it's very difficult to think about anything else when you're holding that clipboard of thoughts away at arm's length. So we encourage people to think about having the thoughts there in front of them on their lap or on the table. And here the thoughts, we make space for the thoughts, they're there, but we can see the bigger picture as well. We can reflect on the thoughts and look at what else is going on and begin to respond more flexibly to them. Other questions that can be helpful to ask are, what would you say to a friend who's having this thought? How helpful is this thought? And increasingly, as we have these discussions, people tend to become more and more aware of their inner critic, and that this is one particular thought rather than just a way of being. Particular story that very often people are fused with when they've been struggling for many years with obesity is a powerful story about themselves, of self-blame and failure. They feel a huge amount of self-criticism, stigma, shame, self-loathing and self-disgust. And of course this is reinforced by many aspects of our culture and media. And it's highly demotivating and overwhelming for people and tends to then shape their reaction to what you might call lapses. Those days you do indulge in that chocolate bar or chips, the people feel angry with themselves but also angry with others. I think the thought comes to mind of, if that's what you think about me, then I'm just going to go and overeat, is what some people often tend to describe their responses to these kind of situations, or when they feel criticized by others. And food can therefore be both a source of comfort and a source of self-abuse at the same time. And noticing this is a particular story rather than the only story or the truth about themselves is a very important shift. And this takes us to that sixth act process of moving to self as context rather than self as content. And I think this is quite a difficult process to get to grips with, and also to convey to clients in ACT terms. And this is where the introduction of compassion-focused therapy can be particularly helpful to help people shift to a more broader and compassionate understanding of their behavior and emotions, and see themselves from a different perspective. So to pause for a moment to talk more broadly about compassion-focused therapy, this was developed by Paul Gilbert, and like ACT, it's a multimodal therapy that builds on CBT and other therapies. And it was specifically developed to address shame, self-criticism, and self-directed hostility by helping people to cultivate a filigree of emotions and compassion. So people living with severe and complex obesity in particular often present with significant feelings of shame linked directly to their weight and appearance, and they may also be experiencing depression, anxiety, and a number of research publications, one of which I've listed in the references, highlight that up to half of those attending specialist obesity services will have experienced kind of childhood trauma and or adverse events in adulthood. So very often these experiences will also contribute to those feelings of shame and self-criticism. So with the publication of Ken Goss's book, which again I've listed in the references on compassionate approaches to overeating, and work by Paul Gilbert has done with commercial slimming groups, there is a growing recognition of the value of compassion-focused therapy in helping people address obesity concerns. And an aspect of compassion-focused therapy that's particularly helpful in terms of introducing different perspectives is to remind us that we're all a product of evolution and repeated patterns that have been created and developed both in our brains and bodies over millions of years. So this applies both to how our brains have evolved and how we think of key behaviors such as eating. So one strand of the evolutionary perspective that's highlighted by Ken Goss is the move from a hunter-gatherer ancestors to where we are with 24/7 home delivery of food available. We have the same brain and the same physiology as our ancestors, who had to exert huge amounts of energy and effort for a meager and irregular supply of food. So they developed what we might call a seafood eater brain, where we didn't finish what was there because we didn't know when the next meal might arrive. Clearly, we live in a very different environment now, one that we can describe as obesogenic, where it's a very different story with our 2-for-1 offers and 24-hour supermarkets and home delivery available online. It's important to highlight this in terms of avoiding that sense of personal blame, but equally encouraging people to take personal responsibility for making changes. We can also see in evolutionary terms that food has been a comfort, a soother, a security, and a reward. So our experiences since infancy have shaped this relationship with food, and it's also reinforced by family, friends, and the wider culture. And people find it genuinely difficult to think of ways to be kind or reward themselves that don't involve food. So for many, food filled a gap where comfort and security were lacking or unpredictable in early life. So, still on an evolutionary theme, a key piece of theory from CFT is informed by recent research in neuroscience, which highlights our emotion regulation systems. And indicates that there seems to be at least 3 related parts of our brain which work together to control and maintain our emotions, as seen here in these 3 circles. This model, 3 circles model as it's called in CFT, provides us with a useful emotional map which helps us understand and be more aware of and manage our emotions and the influence they have in our day-to-day choices. I found it enormously helpful in terms of normalizing the patterns of behavior and thereby reducing the shame and self-blame that people feel about making what might appear to be bad or unhelpful choices. If this isn't familiar to you, I'd advise reading more, and Mary Welford's book offers a great introduction and overview. So in a nutshell, the threat system or alarm system helps us detect danger and respond quickly to threats. And most people are familiar with the idea of fight or flight in relation to physical threats, but may not recognize this also applies to social threats and internal threats such as thoughts, images, or physical sensations. The drive system orients us to look for food, shelter, and of course mates so that we can survive and reproduce. So this system coordinates our goal-directed behavior. We might get a small buzz here when we tick off our to-do list, or a much larger, massive hit if we're lucky enough to win the lottery. The third circle is often the least developed in our clients and therefore a really important area to focus on, and that's the soothing system or caring system. And it's where we are when we feel safe, calm, and connected to others. And how this works will be closely linked to the bonds we form with others, starting with the attachment with carers formed in infancy. So we find that people can readily understand particularly the alarm system, although they may often comment that they tend to be here more often than the other systems or recognize this very readily. The caring system or soothing system is often much less recognizable for people, and this is what we aim to build and strengthen, and drawing on many of the techniques from CFT. It's also been really helpful to integrate these ideas into the choice point model. So understanding how we get hooked into the alarm system at the choice point helps in recognizing and normalizing away moves, while strengthening the caring and soothing system enables people to pause, to notice, and be more able to make towards moves. And increasingly, people start to notice the critical self, and with more ability to take different perspectives, see that this is only one part of themselves rather than the definition of who they are. Rather than question the negative bias of the critical self, we found it's more helpful to explore how helpful or workable it is in terms of achieving goals and maintaining motivation, with questions like, what are the consequences of giving yourself a hard time? Does the critical self help you achieve what's important? What kind of teacher, boss, or coach would you choose? Most people can readily recognize that a highly critical, bullying boss is not going to help them achieve their best at work, and yet very often it's in a similar vein that they talk to themselves. What would it be like if you weren't so hard on yourself? And why is it difficult to be kinder to ourselves? There are many ways of encouraging self-compassion, and certainly exploring the CFT literature will highlight many other avenues, but learning to nurture rather than loathe the body is an important theme that we follow. Developing non-food ways to soothe, calm, and nurture and care for the self, which is certainly an area of challenge for many people, can be a really useful starting point. And towards the end of our program, we would ask all our participants to write a letter of encouragement to themselves, which we then send out 2 to 3 months later. There are many benefits that we found to integrating ACT and CFT, particularly around emotional regulation and the acceptance of emotional distress. In terms of improved eating control, greater self-efficacy, and self-compassion seems to be a real key to maintenance of changes so that when there is a relapse, people can respond to this in a much less critical and negative way, and this seems to enable them to keep in the middle ground of returning towards moves rather than getting stuck back in that cycle, vicious cycle of away moves. So therefore, stabilizing weight and achieving and maintaining further weight loss is a consequence and outcome of this. A quick whiz through the evidence. There's some papers listed there that you can look at in more detail, but just the headlines summarizing these from the published research would highlight the benefits of integrating self-regulation and self-compassion in addressing obesity, and that these approaches, third wave approaches, seem to be more effective than cognitive therapy alone, specifically for reducing binge eating and emotional eating. Again, very quickly, I'll just whiz through some of the outcomes that we found in our own service. In terms of weight loss outcomes, we found that after our 6-month intervention, the mean weight loss for those who complete, that's the blue line at the top, is a respectable 5 kilogram weight loss. What's really encouraging, however, is that if we look at 12 months and 18 months down the line, not only is that weight loss maintained, but it seems to increase slightly, suggesting that there is something important going on here in terms of maintenance. The vast majority of published research suggests that at the end of an intervention, it's very difficult to maintain the weight loss achieved, and very often weight tends to be regained. We also looked at a wide range of other variables that are listed here. These are different scales, but all of these changes are highly statistically significant. And particularly interesting, we see a significant reduction in binge eating and an improvement in emotion regulation, as well as improved mood, quality of life, and nutrition self-efficacy. Perhaps what's really encouraged me and enthused me to continue to use this approach is the very, very positive feedback we've had from the participants in the program. And just a few comments that we've highlighted here. I'll read the comment in the red thought bubble there. I feel like the group sessions were a launching pad for me to go off on my own and put this into practice. I continue to lose weight, and I'm seeing my psychiatrist less, and I have, after many years, been able to secure a part-time job. And this, for me, is so interesting in that it appears that whilst weight loss was a significant part of what went on, the changes that this individual was able to make continued and were much broader than just focused on weight loss after the end of the course. I'll just return, before I finish, to Danny and what he had to say. He was on a very, say, a 2-year journey with us, where he made very significant changes, and I thought it might be nice to finish with some comments from him. I won't read out the whole thing, I'll let you read that for yourself, but I think just the last line there says a great deal. He says, "I'm proud of what I've done, and it's not just what I've done, it's how I think. Life's 10 times better. I mean, I wasn't living before, I am now." So the last couple of slides here, which you'll be sent, just list the references, some background references, the Bio-psychosocial understanding of obesity and weight stigma there, and some books specifically about ACT and CFT, and some of which are specifically focused on overeating and weight concerns. So that's the end of my presentation, but that leaves us with a few minutes, hopefully to respond to some of your questions that you've submitted as we've gone along. Thanks for listening. Okay, so we don't appear to have any questions at this point, but if anybody would like to submit any now, we do have a few minutes for that. I have, at the beginning of the presentation, included my email address, so we've covered a lot of ground, and there's been quite a lot to reflect on here. I'd be very happy if there are specific questions that people wanted to follow up. If you want to contact me directly, that's fine. Okay, so a question that's just come in is, what do I think about monitoring energy intake and expenditure? So I guess what the question is referring to here is perhaps keeping a food diary in terms of calorie intake and monitoring what's eaten in terms of calorie intake and what's being used up. I would be quite cautious about this, because I think it can be useful to get an overall idea, and certainly our dietitians would be working through food diaries with people and perhaps trying to identify areas where they might start to make changes. But I think it's quite difficult to get a very accurate idea of energy intake, because food diaries are notoriously unreliable. We sometimes have used fitness bands or fitness trackers, but again, we would have not tended to encourage people to look at calories burned. We do talk about the general concept of energy balance, but at a fairly theoretical level, rather than trying to get caught up in the details of one particular individual's monitoring of calorie consumption and calorie burning. So another question has just come in: what's the structure of the group program? We've aimed, our program runs over 6 months, and I guess that's because the evidence suggests that the longer people are engaged in the program, the better chance there are of making changes. So they would attend over 6 months every 2 weeks, 2-hour sessions. And we would then continue to have some contact with them over a further 12 months. That's not regular contact. They're able to contact us if they want to, and they come in for review sessions at 6 months and 12 months after the end of the program. So which scales did we use to measure change? We measured anxiety and depression using the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. We used the Derriford Emotion Regulation Scale, which was really interesting in terms of finding that people did particularly make significant changes on emotion regulation, and acceptance of emotions was one of the most striking scales. I probably wouldn't use that going forward because it's such a lengthy measure, and I think what's more important is to get people to complete the measures, so it would err on briefer measures that we can more reliably collect. We're actually just in the process of writing up a more detailed paper on the outcomes, which if people are interested, I'm more than happy to share. And also the binge eating scale was a really valuable measure. It again is quite lengthy, but clinically can be really useful because we can use it to discuss what's going on with and feedback to our clients. So one of the questions that just come in is, how did we measure readiness to change and monitor this during the course? I think we did this in a very individual way. We didn't use a particular questionnaire to monitor readiness to change, because I think we assessed this one-to-one in our assessment. We did ask people, when they were referred, they had to actively make an appointment to come to the service rather than just being sent an appointment, because I think people often are ambivalent about engaging with weight management services, and it can be somebody else's idea to come along rather than their own. But I think using the matrix framework, it helps us understand what is important to the person, what their motivation is. So that's the way we did that, rather than using a standardized measure throughout the program. I'm just looking, there's a few more questions. I probably can't respond to all of those. One of the questions is, did you use ACT and CFT in an integrated way? Absolutely, and hopefully that's what the program shows. I think one of the references that I've included in the final slide talks about the book, The ACT Practitioner's Guide to the Science of Compassion by Dennis Turch, and I think this is a really helpful resource in terms of illustrating how we can integrate ACT with CFT. And I think as far as the participants were concerned, there wouldn't have been a distinction between the two, that one seemed to complement the other really helpfully, so they very much were integrated. And another question I'm just noticing there is around physical activity and exercise, and I haven't mentioned much about that, but that was certainly very much part of the program. So again, often that was around committed actions or goals, would very often be physical activity related. We didn't have a physiotherapist or physical activity instructor within the program, but we worked closely with the third sector locally, and we were able to from time to time have people come along to sessions to answer questions. We had a seated exercise class that was run in conjunction with the service that people could attend, and we had some taster sessions of that within the group sessions. So that was very much integrated, and I guess that would be one of the areas of behaviour change, of committed action, that we regularly highlighted and talked about in the group sessions. That question also refers to dietary, exercise and advice. And again, my dietetic colleagues had a whole wealth of dietetic components. Very often they were hands-on, for example, discussing food labels, measuring food portion sizes, and I think the choice point was a really valuable way to integrate these things, both physical activity and the dietetic components. So if we were talking about a dietary change, we could use the choice point framework to look at why that was challenging or difficult to do, or perhaps similar for physical activity. And another question I'm just noticing there is, yes, we are planning on publishing results. We've just finished writing up the paper, and hope to be submitting that very soon. So if you want to contact me, I can give you more details of where that might be published. So just trying to, there's lots of questions coming in, so we're just trying to work through these and identify the ones that haven't yet been answered. Someone has just asked a question about fear in terms of avoidance of activities, and I think fear and anxiety is a very relevant concept and very much contributes to the tendency to avoid. And I think that's not to be underestimated when people particularly have had challenges with severe obesity for a long time, have perhaps been avoidant of social contact and physical activity. It can be very daunting to start to make changes, and I think that's really important to acknowledge and to help people with managing that anxiety, with being a little kinder to themselves in terms of their expectations and taking small steps. So I think that is a very relevant concept. And what was interesting was, in terms of the outcomes, we noticed a more marked change in mood. So mood improved, but the change in anxiety did come down, but it was a smaller change. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because actually if we're going to start doing new things and making changes in our lives, it's quite a stressful and anxiety-provoking time. But actually it's about willingness to manage that anxiety and understand that anxiety that's important, rather than letting the anxiety push us towards avoidance and away moves. So that's 12:30. Thank you so much for listening. It's great that there have been so many questions once we got started, and I hope that some of those conversations might continue going forward, and I hope that this inspires you to take some of these ideas into your work with this group of people. Thanks very much.